Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Thursday, October 9th, 2025. Professor John Mearsheimer will be with us in just a moment on how much damage has Benjamin Netanyahu done to Israel since October 7th, 2023. But first this. My friends, if you care about your liberty and your right to control your own future, you need to hear about this. From October 10th to 12th, Mikkel Thorpe, host of the Expat Money Show, is bringing together top experts from around the world for the Expat Money Online Summit, and it's completely free to attend. You'll learn how to legally protect your wealth, secure second residences and citizenships, reduce your tax burden, and own property abroad, all to safeguard your freedom. This year's focus is on Latin America, where opportunity is booming. Argentina is shifting to free markets. El Salvador is undergoing a dramatic transformation, and Panama and Paraguay are offering simple residency programs. A Plan B is no longer optional, it's essential. Reserve your free ticket at expatmoneysummit.com. And if you want VIP access with special perks, including lifetime replay access and exclusive VIP panels, use promo code JUDGE for 20% off your upgrade. That's expatmoneysummit.com, promo code JUDGE. Professor Mearsheimer, welcome here, my dear friend. Thank you for accommodating my schedule. Before we explore the economic, political, and cultural damage to Israel itself after 2 years of genocide in Gaza, I want to ask you about something President Trump said just 2 days ago, and that I was asked about on Russian television earlier today, and that is a potential decision to give Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. The president says he's made up his mind, but he hasn't said how he's made up his mind. When I was being interviewed on The Great Game, one of their prominent Moscow talk shows, they asked me a lot of questions. The very first of which they said was on their minds, was this issue of tomahawks. What will happen if Trump gives tomahawks to Ukraine?
Well, if he gives them tomahawks, you still have the question of whether he will give them permission to use those tomahawks. And it's not clear that he will. And if he gives them permission, it's not clear how many he will allow them to use. And my view is, with regard to the tomahawks, that the Russians will be very upset if tomahawks are given to the Ukrainians and they use them. But the key question will be whether or not they do substantial damage, or whether the Russians are able to, in effect, neutralize them, pretty much the way they did with HIMARS and with ATACMS. And I think if it is the case that those tomahawks are given in large numbers and the Ukrainians are given carte blanche to use them, and they do a lot of damage, the Russians would seriously escalate. But I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think he's going to give them tomahawks. He might, but I don't think he will. And if he gives them tomahawks, I don't think he's going to give them many, and he won't give them permission to use them except in very special circumstances.
I'm going to play what President Putin said about this the other day, the essence of which is two issues as I see it. One is the tomahawks cannot be used without U.S. involvement. And two, if U.S. involvement is integral at that level of attacking Russia, it's an entirely different relationship between the United States and Russia. Tell me what you think. Cut number 6.
It's dangerous. As for the tomahawks, it's a powerful arm. Perhaps not the most modernized, but it's powerful. Poses serious threat. This will not change in any way the balance of powers on the battlefield, the fundamental issues of the armed forces of Ukraine, no matter how many UAVs they get, and no matter how many lines they create with those UAVs, without the personnel, there will be no one to lead those battles. They have to change the tactics. Will this pose damage to our relations? Where we see light at the end of the tunnel, of course. Of course. Using tomahawks without direct involvement of the US officers is impossible. Which means a brand new stage of escalation even in the relations between Russia and the US.
Repeat the translator's last line. Using tomahawks without direct involvement of the US officers, meaning human beings to operate them, is impossible. Ritter says that's correct, which means a brand new stage of escalation in the relations between Russia and the US. But before we get to that, why would he give them tomahawks but not give them permission to use them?
I don't know. He may want to show that he's not completely abandoning Ukraine in its moment of greatest need, and this may be symbolic. He may think that he can give them the weapons and not allow them to use them, and he gets the best of both worlds. Who knows for sure? I mean, what Putin is doing here is he's sending a very clear message to Trump, which is to say, don't send those missiles. And I would imagine that Trump has gotten the message. And again, if he gives the missiles to the Ukrainians, and by the way, the Europeans will have to buy those missiles from us.
Right.
The Europeans will give them to the Ukrainians, just to be technically correct.
Right. Well, if that happens, and American technicians accompany these things, and American technicians use them, will the United States be at war with Russia?
No.
In the Kremlin's mind.
In the Kremlin's mind, they're already at war with us. The key issue here is that the Russians are winning on the battlefield, and the tomahawks, as Putin said, are not going to make any difference. It's why it's preposterous to even be talking about doing this. It just is not going to reverse events on the battlefield. The Russians are in control. The tomahawks can't solve the problem. And why, therefore, give Ukraine tomahawks?
All right. You mentioned that the Europeans would have to buy them. Brussels has come up with a scheme for buying them. It will seize 165 billion in Russian state bank accounts in EU banks. It will hold that as collateral for loans to the Ukrainians, which will be used to finance the equipment. I don't know if it's going to be tomahawks, but whatever American arms manufacturers will send. And then, of course, the loans won't be paid back and the collateral will be seized. How will the Russians react? How will the Kremlin react when the EU steals 165 billion from it?
Well, first of all, I want to emphasize again that this is not going to alter the outcome of the war. That's the first and most important point. We in the West have no cards to play here. And furthermore, Trump is slowly but steadily walking away from this conflict and turning it over to the Europeans. And the Europeans are not going to be able to rescue the situation, whether we ship them tomahawks or not. Second point is that it's not clear that that fancy economic deal to steal Russian money is going to be ultimately approved. There is opposition inside of Europe, and I don't know for sure whether it will be put into play. But if it is put into play, the Russians say they will retaliate. They will go after Western assets inside of Russia. And furthermore, lots of people say that the precedent here, in terms of the future of, the international economy, is not good at all. You just don't want to do something like this. And this is
are you conversant enough with EU banking regulations to tell us whether or not the government can do this if the bankers resist? I mean, the money was put in there on a good faith basis. It's earning a lot of interest. It's actually more than 165 billion, but that's what they've targeted. Can Ursula von der Leyen and her warlords just steal money from a bank?
Well, I would assume that if they can develop an overwhelming consensus among EU countries, they can do that. And the question is whether they can achieve a consensus. I've not seen any evidence that people think that the banks will be able to stop this. The banks may be very unhappy, but I think if the political leadership in Europe decides to go ahead with this cockamamie scheme, that they'll do it.
Fascism, private ownership, government control to the point of seizing assets.
This would be a terrible precedent. I mean, I think everybody agrees. I shouldn't say everybody. Lots of people agree on that point.
Right.
This would be a terrible precedent, and it just shows you how desperate we are. I mean, to understand what's going on here with regard to the money and with regard to the tomahawks is that the Ukrainians are about to lose in the war against Russia. And this is going to be a devastating blow for NATO. It's going to be a devastating blow for the West. It's going to be a devastating blow for the leaders in countries like Britain, France, and Germany. And they're doing everything they possibly can think of to forestall this outcome. But as you and I have talked about on many occasions, and all your guests say on a weekly basis, there is no magic formula here for getting out of this mess.
So President Putin has made it clear, and then we'll transition to Israel in a moment. If I may, Professor, President Putin has made it clear that his primary goal is to degrade the Ukrainian military. His secondary goal is to liberate those parts of eastern Ukraine which are arguably Russian. Even if he succeeds in both, won't he be confronting the problem of banderism in Ukraine, which he can't eliminate because it's an idea, it's an ideology, as dangerous as it may be to Putin's understanding of peace?
Just one additional point to the list that you gave, and I think it's his principal goal, is to make sure that Ukraine is neutral, that it's not
correct. Neutral and no NATO. But what about the Nazi-like, the banderism ideology, which has captured the Ukrainian government and military and intelligence services?
I make 2 points about that, which are different points, but I think both very important points. First of all, there is going to be, when this war ends, when the shooting stops and you get a frozen conflict, there's going to be a dysfunctional rump state. And the right-wingers, the fascists, call them what you want, are going to be, in my opinion, in the ascendancy in that rump state. And this invariably is what happens in a war like the one that Ukraine has been fighting against Russia. So I think the right wing, if anything, has been strengthened as a result of this conflict. And I think there's virtually nothing that the Russians can do to change that outcome. The second issue is what happens inside of the territory in Ukraine that Russia annexes. In other words, there are likely to be a substantial number of people inside that territory that Russia annexes who are deeply committed to attacking Russian forces, undermining the Russian annexation. And that could lead to significant conflict inside of the Russian-controlled areas or the Russian-owned areas of Ukraine. So once the shooting stops, right, you get a frozen conflict, I would not be surprised if you have substantial resistance inside of the areas that Russia annexes. And that will create very powerful pressures for ethnic cleansing. The Russians will be motivated to move out people who they identify as sympathetic to the Ukrainian rump state.
Wow.
So the potential for trouble here goes on and on.
Right. A very interesting, typically mearsheimer, brilliant observation that I had not heard before. Switching gears, what is your take on the Trump, Witkoff, Jared Kushner, Tony Blair, Gaza plan?
Well, in a certain way, I think it's wonderful news because it looks like it's going to end the genocide. And I think ending the genocide is of enormous importance. And it does look like it's going to do that. Whether that holds over the long term remains to be seen. But at least for for the time being, it looks like the genocide is going to be shut down. Amen. With regard to creating a viable political solution to, let's call it, the Palestinian problem, I don't think that this comes close to doing that. There are just a huge number of issues that are still on the table that haven't been resolved, that have to be resolved before this problem is largely solved. And also, you just want to keep in mind that the genocidal monsters who run Israel are still in power, and they are still committed to ethnically cleansing Gaza.
Right. Have they ever abided by a ceasefire?
Well,
the short answer is no.
Yeah, the answer is no. But what's very interesting is if you read what's floating around in the media today, it's quite clear that the Palestinians and their allies are aware of that phenomenon that you just described. And they have said that before this hostage exchange takes place, the Israelis are going to have to commit to a peace agreement, that this is the end of the fighting, and that is going to be enforced by the mediators, who I take to be the United States, the Qataris, and maybe the Egyptians. It's not perfectly clear, but it certainly has to include the United States. And furthermore, Judge, you want to understand that President Trump has really put himself out front on this issue. He's really committed to creating peace in Greater Israel. Now, whether he could pull it off, it's a completely different matter. But I'm just saying that Trump has a lot invested in what's happening right now. His reputation is on the line. And he has said that, we're going to get peace. And the Palestinians have said that the mediators, which includes the United States, have agreed that this is not going to start up again. We're not going to go through the first phase. And then when the second phase comes, the Israelis decide that they can undo things like they did earlier this year. So we'll see.
You have articulated what Netanyahu and Smotrich and Gavir and even somebody as moderate by Israeli standards as President Herzog has said before, which is they're going to take Gaza, they're going to mow the lawn, there will never be a Palestinian form of governance there. So where is this going to go? Why would, no matter what Donald Trump promises, Hamas have any faith in the longevity of this beyond the exchange of hostages? The Israelis are returning 1,000 hostages, including this one fellow whose name you may know that the Palestinians regard as their Abraham Lincoln. I forget his name.
Marwan Barghouti.
Correct. And the Hamas people, even though they apparently don't control all the hostages, live and dead, are going to return the ones they control. Why would they expect any agreement to benefit them beyond that exchange? What would prevent the IDF from coming right back into Gaza, whether it's boots on the ground or jets in the skies?
Well, to be clear, I don't know that they're going to let Marwan Barghouti out. The Palestinians have been demanding that, but what the final deal looks like with regard to Barghouti, I'm not sure. With regard to the Palestinians and their trust of Israel, they don't trust the Israelis as far as they can throw them, as I said before. But Hamas is in a really difficult situation. There's tremendous pressure from below inside of Gaza to reach some sort of accommodation and to put an end to the genocide. And as I said before, I do think the agreement that's on the table does put an end to the genocide. And it does give the Palestinians a lot of breathing room. I mean, you want to remember that the Israelis in the next couple of days are going to pull out of Gaza City. They're going to pull out of Rafah. They're going to pull out of Khan Yunis, right? Those are the three big cities in Gaza. And the humanitarian aid is going to flow in. And so this is all wonderful news, given what's been happening over the past 2 years. But the Palestinians understand that they cannot let their guard down, and they have to worry constantly about the Israelis starting this up again. Again, the Israelis are bent. You talk about mowing the lawn. The Israelis are not interested in a situation where the Palestinians in Gaza are in a concentration camp, and every 2 or 3 years they come in and mow the lawn. That's not what they want. What they want is they want to drive all the Palestinians out. That's their goal. And people who have been in charge over the past 2 years, these people who are referred to as genocidal monsters, are still in control. And they still have the same goal. And they'll be looking for every opportunity they can to drive the Palestinians out. The Palestinians know that. And I would bet Trump knows that as well. But the question is, what can Trump do? What can the Palestinians do? And that's why it's hard to say for sure where this one goes over the long term.
How has Israel changed in the past 2 years while its forces have slaughtered 100,000 people?
Look, there's no way you can engage in a war and a genocide like this and it not have a profound effect on your society. And I believe that effect will be overwhelmingly negative. I think that, if this conflict is shut down in a meaningful way, at least for the foreseeable future, and the Israelis are put in a position where they have to reflect on what has happened, they will conclude almost across the board that this has been a disaster. I mean, we talk about the fact that their reputation has been sullied forever. And I think this is certainly true. For the Jewish people to be accused of a genocide is something that is going to be extremely difficult to live with. But it's not just that. If you look at Israel's situation inside of Greater Israel and with its neighbors, the situation is not good at all. Here in the Western media, everybody likes to talk about all these great victories the Israelis have won. Oh, they did this and that to Iran in June and so forth and so on. They decapitated Hamas, they decapitated Hezbollah and so forth and so on. This is not an accurate representation of what has happened. Why are we talking about attacking Iran again in the fall if we beat them in June? The fact is, we, meaning the Israelis and the Americans, didn't defeat them in June. And the reason we're going back after the Iranians in all likelihood in the fall is because we didn't defeat them. They're still there. With regard to Hamas, Hamas is not finished. Look at the deal that's now on the table. Hezbollah is not finished. The Israelis are back to square one in very important ways in a lot of these conflicts. And one could argue in the Iranian case, they're worse off. So I think when you look at the end result of all these battles that they've been fighting, and then when you realize that the long knives are going to come out once the shooting stops and the external threat, in effect, goes away, I think that, people will be out for Netanyahu, and Netanyahu's allies will be out for the opposition, and it will be very ugly inside Israel.
How has everyday life suffered economically and culturally? It can't be the same place that it was on October 6, 2023.
Well, I think economically, it's hard to get good information on that. You occasionally see pieces in the media that say that Israel has suffered enormously. It seems to me, as an observer, without a lot of data, that it's hard to imagine that the Israeli economy hasn't suffered in significant ways from this conflict because it's been so demanding on the society. And with regard to cultural costs, I think the cultural costs are enormous. Again, as I said before, this is a genocide. right? You know, here in the West, the mainstream media goes to great lengths to downplay that fact. But around the world, and when you talk about all of these human rights organizations that focus on issues like genocide and international institutions that focus on genocide, there's an overwhelming consensus in those human rights organizations and in these international institutions that this is a genocide. The Wall Street Journal and Israel's supporters can deny it, but anybody who looks at the facts, as these human rights organizations do, can't help but conclude that this is a genocide. And if you don't like the word genocide, let's call it mass murder. But 2 years of mass murder, when you look at what's happened to the Palestinians, when you look at the damage which has been recorded by cameras and by videos, and you look at what the Israelis post on social media, in terms of them humiliating and murdering Palestinians, it's just unimaginable that they're not going to suffer an enormous cost over time for what they have done.
As we are taping this, it's late in the afternoon on Thursday, October 9. Tomorrow on Friday, October 10 at 5 in the morning Eastern Time, the Nobel Peace Prize will announce its winner. President Trump was nominated by Prime Minister Netanyahu, something that, to your thinking and mine, is so incongruous you can't even get your hands around it. But apparently his principal opposition is the children of Gaza.
Well,
what can you expect?
Yeah, he's not going to get a Nobel Prize tomorrow. Because this peace deal or this ceasefire deal has been worked out after the voting took place. So I don't think it's possible. Furthermore, I find it hard to imagine that Donald Trump, who's been complicit in this genocide since taking office on January 20th, would get a Nobel Peace Prize.
Was Genocide Joe nominated also?
No, not that I know of. But the point I would make to you is if Trump doesn't get the Nobel Prize, he's going to want to get it next year. And that's going to give him a very powerful incentive to do everything he can to make sure that this ceasefire sticks and that events move towards a more peaceful Middle East. I was listening to him before. He was making some comments about Iran and where U.S.-Iran relations are going, and he was actually sounding remarkably moderate. And I think one could argue if he doesn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, which for reasons I don't fully understand, he so thoroughly covets, one could argue that he will go to great lengths in the months ahead to do everything he can to make sure that he maximizes his chances of getting the prize next year.
Well, then he's going to have to cut off the gravy train to Netanyahu.
Well, he's at least going to have to make the ceasefire stick in Gaza. That's for sure. And he's going to have to do something with regard to the West Bank as well. And he understands that, I think. And you see that reflected in his comment that Netanyahu cannot annex the West Bank. But as you have said on a number of occasions, in a de facto way, he is in the process of annexing the West Bank, which of course is correct. But Trump is trying to stand up to him on de jure annexation, for what that's worth. And but anyway, he desperately wants the Nobel Peace Prize, and if that causes him to behave in a more peaceful manner vis-a-vis all these crises that we're involved in around the world, that's all for the good.
Absolutely. Professor Mearsheimer, thank you very much, my dear friend. As always, appreciated. As always, you've been kind enough to accommodate my schedule. We'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
As will I.
Thank you, Professor. And coming up today, still to come at 4:30 this afternoon, is the Gaza peace deal credible? Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.